Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Keep Talking podcast. I'll be your host today, Noah, and this will be my co-host, Timwi.
Hello, I hope that everything's working and you can all hear me.
I vaguely heard my own voice, so I believe we're good.
Okay. You heard the news of my friend that I told you some weeks ago. I have this friend who was working on his master's thesis. He had this really unfortunate hard disk crash. So, he was working on it for like 2 or 3 weeks, and then he had this hard disk crash. And, I was really nervous when I heard that. But then later he told me, oh, don't worry about it, I have a backup. And, then obviously there is a sigh of relief. And we would all have a sigh of relief at that, right? Even though the hard disk is still broken, right? The event still happened. You didn't undo the event. You've only maintained the data, right? So that got me thinking. Why are we so nervous when the hard disk crashes, and why are we so relieved when we find out that we have a backup, even though the hard disk is still broken?
Because one is easily replaceable.
Exactly. Very good.
I'm glad I got the right answer. Thank God.
You're welcome. So that got me thinking. Then, why do we mourn and grieve when somebody dies? Right. The answer is very simple. It's because they're gone. They're irreplaceable. Right. So
yes,
so death is a moment of great loss. Something that was in your life for a long time potentially is gone, and the stuff that was lost, the person that was lost, is unrecoverable. Right. So now I'm imagining in a possible future world in which we might be able to take a backup of a person just before they die.
That
you see where I'm going with this, right?
I saw where you were going, and then you went somewhere else.
That's interesting.
But I understand where we're heading, though. The idea would be then that the person's information is not being lost the same way the hard disk's information wasn't lost despite the hard disk being lost.
That's right. So your job now is to convince me that there is a fundamental and important difference between these scenarios that would convince me that the person that you have a backup of is still lost, and the backup is somehow not a full recovery.
I feel like it's hard to convince you about this for someone else.
All right,
but I'm sure you personally would feel that your backup would not fully replace you and would be concerned if this were the case.
I'm not sure about that.
Interesting.
Right. So obviously I've thought about this a lot, and you've thought about it a lot. So I suggest that we talk about this for the next hour or so, and hopefully some people will find this interesting. This relates to a question in philosophy that came about due to modern scientific media, science fiction media, most notably Star Trek, which have a fictional technology in them, which can, decompile all of your atoms into a, matter stream, and then reconstitute the person in a different location in such a way that, everything's the way it was. It's still the same person. All of the information is in it, right? So a lot of people, especially philosophers, said that, well, you can probably reconstitute the person, and the person will think of themselves as the same person because they have all the memories, but actually the original person died because you took them apart, atom for atom. At that point, it's no longer a person, so that is an event of death. Okay, so this question of, did the person die despite still being there? Or is that actually the same person because they think they are the same person? That is widely known as the transporter paradox. So I'm going to put that up on the screen as our topic for today. And I want to hear your opinion.
So I'd like to get out of the way the major, what I felt like upon what I've known about this being the consensus, being that consciousness is continuous, definitively. That is to say that they would not be the same person because their consciousness wasn't continued. There was a jarring break in it, the same way that functions are continuous and shouldn't have breaks in them.
So in what sense is this conscious stream interrupted, given that the person themselves has no such experience?
In the span of actual time, it would be interrupted.
Yeah, but the person doesn't feel that.
That's the thing, is like, I think for the person, like, and like, this is what's interesting, where this becomes so interesting, is that, like, outwardly, other people, personally, I feel like only the person going through the teleporter really cares, because other people, if you are can completely be one-for-one reconstructed, you are by definition replaceable in that moment. So outward people don't care, but the inward person doesn't care, because the exact thing that you just said, it doesn't feel like anything. Their consciousness hasn't stopped for them, it's only stopped for the world around them. So I feel like this is only a philosophical caveat rather than a practical one.
So this is interesting. So you are saying that if your best friend were to go through the transporter, you'd have no issue with that. You would not consider them to be dead and replaced with an imposter.
I'd consider them to be dead and replaced with themselves, not necessarily an imposter.
Okay, so let me ask you this. Is that replacement comparable or equivalent to, let's say your friend dies and is, officially declared brain dead or so, but is then resuscitated through some, medical technology? Such cases already exist, right? There are people who have been declared dead and have then been revived, or in some way their life has been restored. In many cases, even without any permanent sort of repercussions.
It's interesting. That depends entirely on the time frame. I don't think it would be bad per se. Like, I wouldn't think of them any differently. Their personality-wise, they'd still be the same person as far as I'm concerned, on, like, I guess, a philosophical level. But in a practical level, if this goes for 10 years, my opinion on them could have very well changed in 10 years, despite the fact that they didn't exist.
So what opinion exactly do you say could have changed?
My personal opinion of them. I could think different things about them in the span of time that elapsed.
But then how is that different from someone who was never dead? Because surely your opinions of people change all the time. Even if just in subtle ways, but, people change, so your opinions of them change, right?
I guess this is the exact opposite of what you just said. People change, so my opinions of them change. This is a person not changing, and my opinion of them changing. Which is to say that time is the grand factor of change rather than what anyone does.
So if I may come back to my original question then, imagine my hypothetical friend, who, by the way, is completely fictional. I made that story with the master's thesis, but imagine you actually had that friend, and he did take a backup of his master's thesis just before the hard disk crashed, so he has no work lost. But you sigh the sigh of relief because he told you that he has a backup. But he then says, yeah, but, it's only a backup. It's not the original thesis, the one that I wrote. That one was on the hard disk, and the hard disk is gone. And you can sort of see that he feels some sort of great loss or something. How would you respond to this friend? How would you...
I personally would think he is a crazy person.
Right.
That being said, I know... So you're talking about a hypothetical. I know a musical artist who is very similar to this. Specifically, he mourned greatly that one of his original albums recorded in the 80s was recorded on these large, hulking tapes, right? That all were, use magnetism to keep things in place to make the sound work. The idea is that over time, the tapes slowly stop working. Like, their efficacy decreases and they lose fidelity because they are recorded on analog materials that wear over time. But despite the fact that he has perfect copies of this album that he produced back then that are digital now and sound exactly the way they did originally, he still mourns for the loss of the original that was created in this and it's slightly different example because it's a different format, this archaic format, but still there's something about being original versus an exact copy.
Okay, so in that case then, what exactly counts as the original? Because let's say you meet a friend, or let's say you have a friend from high school, so it's been a long time since you first met them. You've already hinted that people change, we've already hinted that people change. So after 10 or 20 years of knowing them, they might not really be the same person at all anymore. And they will fully acknowledge that fact.
Mm-hmm.
Most people who change feel that their change is a change for the better, and therefore do not object to it.
Yes.
Right. So when someone dies, we all mourn because we've lost something that's irretrievable. But if you think about it, that person that you knew 20 years ago is also irretrievably lost, but we don't mourn that.
I don't think we mourn it as widely, but I definitely do think it is mourned. And a lot of people, the phrase exists, this person is dead to me. The idea that the person you once knew is gone is very relevant to the world. And in a lot of ways, a lot of people they'll think about their old friends and they'll be more sympathetic to the friend they knew rather than the friend that they no longer know who still exists. Like, does that make sense? Like, someone I knew 20 years ago, I'm 21, that doesn't make sense. Someone I knew 10 years ago who I don't know now, I care much more about this person when they were 11 than I care about them now that they're 21. And in many ways, what happens to this person in the present has nothing to do with the person that I saw in the past. And I do still mourn the loss of people in the past like that.
Okay. Well, that's interesting. But of course, in general parlance, you would still accept calling them the same person, right? And it's really just the sort of philosophical thought that you have right now that it is on some level a different person, right? But in sort of everyday discourse, we all agree that it's the same person.
Yes, I feel like most normal people do that.
Right. So this is what confuses me, that when it comes to people who change over the course of 10 or 20 years, people are perfectly happy to call them the same person. But if they just step through a transporter, even one that in our thought experiment we define the premise that the transporter is perfect and that the person that comes out is exactly the same. Even then, a lot of people will say that that's now a different person, and that their existence has somehow been interrupted, or that a new existence has spawned into existence.
I think so. This is interesting. I think this is an interesting thought of what the word death means. The human dies. The person, I don't think necessarily does. If we're talking about it like this, the agency of that person never is compromised. The person is immediately, their consciousness it feels like nothing has ever happened, but their body is dead, is disassembled, it is no longer alive for the time it is in transit. So the human dies versus the person who lives.
It's interesting that you make that distinction, because that's very analogous to the distinction between the hard disk and the data on the hard disk. Because the data is no longer on the hard disk. In fact, it may be on a flash drive, which is not connected to the computer, and therefore doesn't have any electronics in it running. So in a sense, you could say that the data is, it is held, but it's dead. But then at some point, you plug it back into the computer, and now the data is brought back into existence.
Yes. The hard disk dies, the thesis never does.
Exactly. Right. So if you acknowledge the similarity and the analogy, then you still haven't explained to me. Oh, actually, I need to correct my thought here, because you did say that you wouldn't mind if your friend stepped through the transporter. It's only yourself that you'd have an issue with if you had to do that.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about that. So you said that there is a continuity of consciousness that you feel is essential to consider you the same person. Is that right? Is that a fair characterization? Yes. Okay. In that case, what do you do when you fall asleep?
Interesting.
Are you now a new person when you wake up?
So I feel like this is annoying because the word for being knocked out or passing out is being called unconscious. So maybe I'm not using the word consciousness as I should be. There's like your brain is still actively participating towards the person that you are while you're asleep through dreaming and whatnot, and just actively being alive. I think a much better example would be someone who went brain dead and was then resuscitated.
Well, but
being.
What if we were to discover that actually you're not conscious the whole time while you sleep?
If your brain were to die during sleep, well, I would consider that an interruption of consciousness. That being said,
no, but I'm sorry, I'm getting strung up here on your use of the term consciousness, because
yes,
okay, so the matter of fact is that we do in fact lose consciousness during sleep. We don't actually dream the whole time. So our consciousness is in fact interrupted. But what you seem to be implying is that even if we're not conscious in the sense that we're thinking or making decisions right now, at least there is something going on in the brain. The brain is kind of active. And the continuity of that kind of brain activity is what you're really looking for. Am I right?
Yes, and I don't have a word for that, so I've been using consciousness as my de facto word.
All right.
Yes.
So let's try and avoid the word consciousness.
Sure.
Maybe you laugh because I introduced you to the idea of tabooing a word in a discussion on a thought experiment like this. So let's quickly introduce that to our viewers, shall we?
Sure. I don't know if I heard this from you or on a video, but I know what you're talking about.
Well, the general idea is that, sometimes the people debating have a slightly different or maybe even a wildly different idea of what a specific word means. But the debate isn't about what the word means. The debate is about the concepts or ideas or what is true. Right? So one way to get at the heart of that is to actually stop using that word and to try and circumlocute, i.e., use other words to describe the meat of the issue that you're actually talking about. So in this case, this is why I'm saying we shouldn't be using the word consciousness. So you're looking for a continuous activity in the brain. And as soon as that continuous activity is interrupted, you consider the person to be dead. Is that right?
Yes.
So
I think that was the idea.
Okay, so then let's move on to the person who is actually brain dead and then resuscitated. What's your take on that?
It's an interesting question. Again, the person doesn't think that anything's changed. The person's consciousness picks up right back where it left off. Mine doesn't, though. It's almost like imagine this, imagine time being folded on a sheet of paper, and then this person suddenly gets to fold the paper back so that their consciousness lines up. But it ignores all of the context of my life going on from this person. In my eyes, this person could have changed, or even like the idea of this person, the person that I held in my head, that I thought of them, changed over time, despite the fact that the person who was brain dead did not. So when they wake back up, they feel like a different person from the person that I held of them in my head, the picture of them that is held by others. I don't think that's avoidable either. I don't think it makes them a different person on a philosophical sense. Maybe it's just they're a different person relative to you because your position has moved. So suddenly
they're a different person relative to me because my position has moved?
Yes, so they're different to you than they were before through no fault of their own, through only your perspective shifting.
Interesting that you feel the need to emphasize that it's through no fault of their own. Are you trying to cover some bases here? Are you afraid that you might be, treating the person unfairly by telling them that they're a different person than the one you were friends with?
No, I meant to highlight the fact that, again, to keep it grounded, that they were not the one changing themselves. You were changing them on your end.
But you were only changing your conception of them, right?
Yes.
Which obviously is important to you, but it doesn't really answer the question whether the person died. You know, I mean, your conception of the person isn't a whole person in their own right. Right? You do not hold a copy of another person inside of you. If we could do that, we would have infinite nesting of people inside people. You know, that's obviously not possible.
Yes. Like on the philosophical objective level, the person hasn't died, but because everyone goes through this, there's so many other things that we're going to talk about that relate to this. But the idea that, like, is a person the objective person, or is a person what everyone thinks of them?
Well, everyone is quite a lot of people. Let's bring a hypothetical friend into the conversation that you and I both know, but you and I, we have different conceptions of. Like, you know,
yes.
maybe you value their artistic talent, so you think they're a great artist, whereas I think that actually their art is mediocre, but their singing is absolutely stellar. So in a sense, we're focusing on different aspects of these of the person, and each of those aspects clearly isn't the whole person.
Yes, but could be said that with a large enough sample size, their person could be the average of all of these perceptions.
But this average will shift as, you know, people shift either their opinion of the person, or even forget about the person, or even die, so that their conception of the person dies with them.
Yes, so that gets us right to what I was talking about. On the objective level, the person hasn't changed, but as the world moves around them, if they're not able to react, then all of the perceptions do, which I feel like makes the person doesn't think they've changed, but to the world they have. Again, through none of their own doing.
I guess I agree with that. I mean, we're now once again talking about gradual changes that people undergo, and everyone agrees that that doesn't make them a whole new and different person.
I don't think, in the case of the cut and dry transporter paradox, I don't think necessarily that it makes them a different person. Actually, even in the idea of being brain dead and whatnot, yes, I'd say objectively they are the same person, and the conversation has moved from there to, but is objectively being the same person more useful than whether they are subjectively the still same person, which I think they are not. I think subjectively they're a different person altogether.
And how does that? Why doesn't that contradict what you said earlier? That because you said that it wouldn't bother you if a friend went through the transporter. But
because the transporter is instantaneous. With the brain dead situation, it's a matter of time that passes.
Okay, then how long a time? How long a time does it need to be? Because the transporter is not literally instantaneous, right? I mean, even the fictional transporter in Star Trek isn't instantaneous. It takes on the order of maybe 2 or 3, maybe 5 seconds, I haven't counted, to transport a person or to rematerialize the person. And there have been, you know, isolated cases in which people have spent a fair amount of time as a sort of, you know, shapeless matter stream inside of the transporter while people try to fix some kind of problem with it, and then they rematerialize. You know, so if that window of quote unquote not existing, as you would call it, can be arbitrarily, you know, lengthened or shortened, where is your cutoff line? You know, and at which point would you say that still counts as instantaneous, but that doesn't?
Those are two completely different questions. What still counts as instantaneous versus what is impactful? How long do you think it takes for someone to be absent for your opinion on them to start to shift? And I think this is a personal question that does not have an objective answer. But like for me, probably, it definitely depends on the context. It depends on who the person was to you.
I'm still a bit confused because when we went into this, your premise was that other people walking into the transporter you don't think of them as having been murdered or anything. But you yourself wouldn't go through the transporter, so...
I didn't say I wouldn't go through the transporter. I said I'd definitely be nervous about it. I'd be worried about it. I'd be concerned.
Okay, can you be a bit more specific? Because, I mean, if the technology is new, then obviously everyone's going to be nervous about it. You know, people were nervous about airplanes when they were new, and helicopters, and everything. But
Okay.
I'm going to make it part of our premise that the hypothetical transporter we're talking about is at least as safe as air travel is right now, right? And people do go on airplanes. Most people have no issue with going on airplanes.
Yes. So the idea is why I would be concerned is because I experience my consciousness as the living being that I am. The person on the other side of the teleporter will also have experienced my consciousness because they're being created with my exact brain. However, I will no longer be experiencing. The person who steps into the teleporter is not oh, this is weird to explain.
The real question is why? Why is the person stepping into the transporter not the same person?
Literally, the living being is dead. And even though the consciousness is still alive, and the consciousness gets transformed to another living being that is a one-to-one replica, the living being that I was when I stepped in there is dead. And not only that, but I take this to the next level, you would never get over it. It would never be okay, because every time you rematerialized, you wouldn't remember what that felt like, because you were dead during that time. Your consciousness was dead during that time, or was, on this hold state. So the nervousness would never go away, because I would never realize that, oh, it's just safe, and I'll just continue thinking, because that life form, that being, will have ended before the new one shows up. Or the being will have ended at the same time it is taken apart. So the new one that's recreated will never have the memory of being taken apart.
In that case, let me bring to the table yet another hypothetical scenario, in which let's say you go into some kind of medical procedure, maybe an operation or something, right? And they give you some kind of chemical, a sedative of sorts, that will block your short-term to long-term memory consolidation, right? And let's say, for the sake of this argument, this drug works so perfectly that you will not remember literally anything that happened, within a window of maybe 2 or 3 hours, right? Okay. So now, after the operation, you are told that this happened, and that you were. Actually, it doesn't even matter if you were conscious or awake during the procedure, but regardless, you are told that this happened, and the reason you have no memories of it is because they specifically suppressed those memories. What would your feeling then be of going into such a procedure again a second time? Do you see the parallel? Do you accept that this is an analogy? Yeah, okay.
I do. It's one of those things where it feels different, but I don't have a good reason, so it very well might not be. But how sometimes new technology can do old things, but the new ones are scary because they're new. But I think part of it is I can't see it being easier than before. Even undergoing a really, a risky surgery. Granted, you won't be able to remember anything that happens, but you could die. It's a chance that that's going to happen. Never mind. Actually, this is perfect. Imagine the parallel here being you could die versus you will die and you will still wake up. Is the bad part of dying the not waking up again?
To me, yeah. Not to you, I take it?
I don't know. This is a seriously different question, because so I've got some very weird feelings about this topic, regardless. Even if I was flat out told, yeah, you're going into the teleporter, the you here will die, but another one of you will happen, I'd be nervous, but I'd still, it's basically, confronting the question, am I ready to die? Right away is if this doesn't work as planned, do I just die now? And that's part of the same thing that goes on a surgery, but
Yeah, but in that thought, aren't you assuming that
you're not gonna wake up?
No, you're assuming that whatever happens in the transporter qualifies as dying. But for some reason, you don't make the same assumption when you fall asleep or when you're under anesthesia.
Well, it's because the teleporter, by definition, stops your heart from beating, stops the living organism from existing. The living organism literally dies, during the teleporter example. I believe that they are not literally killing me under anesthesia. Again, the person lives, but it's the living organism that dies, which is the concerning part.
Yeah. Okay, so I guess at this point we need to taboo another word. We need to taboo the word die.
Okay,
I mean, you've already taken a step in the right direction, which is to clarify what you mean by dying, and you've emphasized that to you it's the body, the machine, the heart stops beating, electrical signals in your brain aren't transmitted anymore, whatever, right? But my contention is that all of these things are comparable to the hard disk that crashed, which doesn't matter as long as you have the backup. So my argument is that the only thing that really matters, the only thing that is really valuable because it's irreplaceable, is the information that makes up your person, your personality, your thoughts, your experience, your memories, everything that makes you you, right? But your body, I mean, at the moment you could argue that your body is part of you, but if we could have a full sort of mind transplant between bodies, I think most everyone would agree that the new person in the new body is still you.
Yes, but the mind is still being transplanted. So I guess when I say the living organism dies, I'm specifically...
Right.
well, like...
Yeah, so that takes me then to the question, do we really need to make a distinction between transmitting the actual physical mind and transmitting the information that makes up the mind? I mean, let's contrast two procedures, one in which you literally take brain out of your skull and put it into another skull, versus one in which you reconstitute an existing brain in such a way that all of its neurons are arranged in the same way that they are in your brain. So it is effectively becomes the same brain, but it is made of foreign neurons, I suppose you could say. See, I would contend that the difference in these procedures is merely an implementation detail, and the result is the same, and therefore the consequence should be considered to be the same.
This goes hand in hand with an extremely important topic, which is controversial. So I'm glad we're bringing it up right now. This heavily depends on what you think happens when the living organism stops existing, because you tabooed the word death. Even though the consciousness continues, and there is another person to take your place with the exact same consciousness that thinks and breathes and acts exactly the same way you did, something happens to this body, the one that you're in. Something happens to this brain. This brain doesn't get to live on. All of the information gets to live on, but the brain doesn't.
Yeah, exactly. Which again takes me back to the hard disk that crashed. That one also doesn't get to live on, but nobody cares.
I guess
nobody cares because the hard disk is replaceable.
But the hard disk might care. The person might be worried about their brain dying because they need to think, okay, what happens to, like, even if the consciousness continues, it's almost like, okay, here's a beautiful example of this. What if you were born as a different person? Or like, what if you woke up one day as a different person?
How do you define different person?
Like, literally, like,
but
imagine...
I want to draw your attention to the inherent contradiction in that question, because you used both the words you and the words different person.
Yes, okay. So imagine... Okay, so yes, this is important, because that's exactly the contradiction I'm trying to get at. Okay. Imagine you went to sleep, and see, that's the thing. Like, you, quote unquote, woke up as a different, like, I guess it comes down to the idea of what you are. Because I understand, I don't even feel the need to explain this more, because you already get it, because it's the contradiction. But like...
Okay, so in fiction, when there are a lot of stories that are based on the premise that you suddenly wake up in a different place, in a different body, with a different voice, and people recognize you as a different person, but your consciousness is still yours. So it's kind of like a mind transfer, like, what I described earlier. And in these, invariably it is always depicted as the person is the same person that was originally in a different place and a different body, rather
That is
than...
not what I'm talking about. Literally, like, and it's so difficult to explain because it completely contradicts the entire, like, sort of premise that we've been talking about. What if you woke up with somebody else's consciousness? What if you were the consciousness of another person? Not you with your memories and you, Timwi, but, like, can you imagine being someone else within their thoughts, in their life, them, not you anymore?
Well, the thing is, what makes me me in that scenario? You know, what is the difference between that scenario and one in which simply, that person just exists?
And that's a beautiful question. I don't have an answer to that. But
well, to me, the answer, to be honest, is clear. If the brain of that person hasn't changed, or more precisely, the information that makes up the person, then it is the same person. And therefore, to ask, what if you were to wake up as that person, just simply makes no sense. The question doesn't make sense.
Well, you're on a fundamental level, you're correct. It doesn't make sense. But it feels like what feels natural and intuitive to me is that there's some other continuousness that is not your consciousness that exists, which seems extremely strange, and I have no way to define it, but it seems obvious and intuitive to me, despite the fact that it's senseless.
Then maybe we need to get at the heart of that intuition. What drives that intuition?
I think it's got to do with the very, very common belief in a soul.
Do you believe in a soul?
That's an amazing question. Because when you ask me that question, my gut response is no. But then why do I have this intuition? Maybe the intuition is left behind from when I did.
What would happen? I mean, could you reevaluate that intuition in the light of this new realization that you don't actually believe in a soul?
No, it still makes perfect sense.
All right.
Like, to me, it still makes 100% sense, despite the fact that I know that there's no backing for it anymore.
All right, let's try this then. Try and rephrase the intuition without using the word consciousness. And possibly even without using the word I or you, but I realize that's a bit hard.
Yeah, I was going to say. I think what it sort of gets at... So, I'd rather, instead of pointing out why it makes sense, I'm going to point out extremely clearly why it doesn't, and get at the heart of this. In that scenario, where person A is, quote-unquote, wakes up as person B, and has their exact consciousness, their exact thinking and everything, and there's observably no difference. What is to say that this isn't happening constantly and everyone is, quote-unquote, waking up as different people every day? There's literally no way that anyone would be able to distinguish that.
That's basically what I was hinting at, yes. It is indistinguishable from not happening. So by Occam's razor, we should say that it's not happening.
Yes.
That's kind of like saying, okay, I have this red apple here on my desk, right? That apple could be changing its color very rapidly between pink and cyan or bluish in such a way that it averages out to be red. Who are we to say that it isn't doing that? Well, it's Occam's razor. If both explanations give you the exact same if both explanations give you the exact same observations and they are observationally indistinguishable, then the one that makes fewer assumptions is the one that wins, is the one that we should take seriously, is the one that we should consider for further thought. This is not necessarily saying that this is the one that's true, but it's rather saying that all of them are equally true, and therefore we might as well, make it easier for ourselves by considering only the one that uses the fewest assumptions.
The idea here was not to propose something that, again, the idea here was to highlight that it doesn't make sense, but to capture the intuition for what it is, which is the idea that despite the fact that this is obviously not true and none of us are going to pretend that this is actually happening, the intuition states that it would make a difference to something. There's a you that exists outside of your human person and outside of your agency that is a greater you.
Okay,
that is what the intuition is.
This sounds like the distinction between dualism and monism, where dualism, is the philosophical stance that there are these two separable aspects to a person. One of them is the mental, which I call the information that makes up the person that you are, and the other one is the physical, which is your body.
Mm-hmm.
And monism, monism is the more recent one, because monism, which obviously holds that the two are inseparable. There is really only one thing. There is only the person. Monism only came out of the realization from science that really we don't have a soul, or at the very least that a soul isn't necessary to explain all of the observations that we make about people's behaviors and what people say their thoughts are and things like that. Intuitively, most people are dualists, which is why that was the prevailing stance for almost all of human history. Right? We are born dualists. Children, toddlers, if you run any sort of experiments to determine whether their intuition is a dualist or a monist one, it always comes out dualist, right? Mm-hmm. And if you think these kinds of fictions that I mentioned, where someone sort of swaps body with someone or swaps mind, which is the same thing, these stories are fundamentally dualist in their premise, and to a real sort of diehard monist, these stories should make literally no sense.
Yes.
The only way that such a story could make sense to a monist is if
so we're literally swapping brains.
Exactly.
So this explains the entire thing. So I'm glad that you brought this up. I live in this crazy world where my dualist intuition. I have this dualist intuition, despite the fact that I'm a monist. So the idea is that, on one hand, one person is the monist idea of a person, right? It is literally that the brain and mind, or the brain and body, are inseparable. And the other is this floating shell of what once was a second idea of a person that now has no content in it, that I still feel like exists, despite the fact that there's nothing there to explain.
Right, so the question then becomes, are you willing to shed that belief or intuition, whatever you want to call it, because you now realize that monism is the scientifically accurate explanation?
Can you shed an intuition?
That's a very good question. I don't know.
Have you ever just thought like, oh, this makes sense, and then someone's like, oh, well, it's not true, and you go, oh, yeah, no, it doesn't make sense anymore. You're right.
Yeah, exactly. People can't do that easily. I mean, people might be able to do that over the course of years, by repeatedly reminding themselves that they have this intention to change their mind on that. But yeah, you can't just snap your finger and ta-da. Because if you could do that, then you're effectively changing yourself and you're becoming a new person, right? If you could do that too often, then all of the people who met you yesterday would no longer recognize you today. But anyway, in all of this, I suddenly noticed something.
Mm-hmm.
In this entire discussion, you've never asked me whether I would be nervous to step into the transporter.
Incorrect. That was the first thing I said to you. I said it hypothetically. Technically, you could have referred to myself in that context. You had assumed that I meant myself, but I had said that I imagine you would be worried about that, and then you said no, I would not, and used that to imply that I would be.
Well, that's interesting, because that means that my state of mind must have had a different context at the time. Because right now, my thought is that I would certainly be nervous, right? Even well, actually, I could see myself not being nervous anymore once I've done it a lot of times, right? But even if I know that a lot of people use the transport every day and it's fine, transporter accidents are extremely rare and usually don't result in death, I would probably still be nervous simply because I don't know what the subjective experience of it would be. And it could be something unpleasant. It could even be, hell or torture or agony. But but once I've done it several times and I have no memories of it being agonizing or hellish, then those fears would certainly subside eventually, and I would just expect it to go the same way that it did in the past, even if I remind myself that there is, what you said, that there may be this part of your existence that you can't remember because it's you in the process of being deconstructed, atomized, right? You can never remember that part of the experience. I think I would optimize that away through experience. I would tell myself every time that I used the transporter in the past, it was fine, so it's going to be fine this time. And if something unusual happens, then that would be a rare case. It's kind of, actually, now that I think about it, that intuition would be similar to the one saying to yourself, well, if I step into this airplane, maybe this will be the first time that I'll be involved in a plane crash. That could always happen. But once you've been on an airplane like 47 million times, no, that's a bit many, let's say 24 million, then you start saying to yourself, it's obviously fine. From experience, we know that it's fine because we've done it a lot of times.
I don't think those are as comparable as you made it out to be. I think the much better comparison was the anesthesia knocking you out, because you remember the flight on the airplane, and you can say that, maybe this is my first experience having a plane crash, but you remember most experiences being all right.
Okay, then let's take the anesthesia. Let's say I'm such an unlucky person with such a broken body that I need such an operation under anesthesia all the freaking time.
My condolences.
Even then, I would get used to it. I would say to myself, it was fine the last, 24,567,837 times that I did it. Why would the 24,567,838th time be any different?
I think so, and we sort of came up to what this meant, or where we were going with this when we originally said, I asked, is the only part about this to you the waking up? Is that the only scary part? And you said yes. To me, I am extremely scared of feeling the pain and then not remembering the pain. And this is, it's a totally different topic. The idea of which is worse, the pain or the memory of the pain. To me, the pain is infinitely worse than the memory of it.
I would agree, but there is an important distinction here, which is that the pain in the moment, only exists for the moment, whereas the memory of it is something that you carry for your life.
Yes,
and in fact, the memory can cause further pain. It can cause, for example, stress disorder, traumatism.
Oh, yes.
So by suppressing the memory of it, even if the pain in the moment was agonizing, by suppressing it, you save all of that other trouble.
That's not the part I'm worried about. I'm worried about it hurting. I'm worried about the pain. I'm not worried about the long form things. So this, I'm trying to think of a better example than the one.
No, I think I get it. I am, of course, also scared of being in pain.
Maybe so you are human.
Maybe the dentist might be a good example. There's something that a lot of people have to go through, and they all know that it's painful. They know that beforehand going in, and they know that they have to be brave and just sit through the pain in order to reap the net benefit of not having toothache the whole time, or rotting teeth, or whatever it is that the dentist is fixing. The cost-benefit analysis. And
yes,
if I could go into the dentist knowing that I have to have this treatment either way, if I could then choose between not remembering it or having to remember it, I would prefer to not remember it.
Interesting. Okay, I'm going to take this into a different context because there's something really interesting about this. I am terrified to death of animal stings, like bee stings, for instance. I have this extremely adverse reaction to even hearing a bee next to me because I'm terrified of the pain. I've been stung by a bee before. It was fine. I don't even remember it hurting at all, but because I can't remember what the sensation was like, I'm still in massive fear of it happening. I would much rather remember the pain so that I could so that I had that stored so I could remember what it was like and realize it's not something to be worried about, versus not remembering and then having to experience it again for the first time when it happens.
Well, that's interesting, because now it's becoming apparent that the fear of pain itself is a type of pain, right? And
yes.
having memories of it not being as bad as you thought it was going to be can be soothing. So,
yes.
Therefore, the decision of whether you want to have your memory suppressed or not must depend on
how bad it was.
No, it must depend on yet another cost-benefit analysis. Because on the one hand, you'd rather not have the pain, but on the other hand, if you can soothe your pain,
if I can cease the fear, whereas the pain is momentary, the fear is again like another long-lasting side effect where not only it like causes me to physically wince whenever a bug is around me, but to also have this long-standing thing inhibiting me from going outside.
So it seems that we've pinpointed 3 separate factors that need to go into this decision. The first one is how much pain is it. The second is how much fear of pain do you experience before it. And the third one, which we haven't quite emphasized yet, so I'm going to emphasize it, is how often does it happen, right? If you live in an area of the world where there are bees around you a lot, then it's a more common issue and therefore a bigger deal than if it's like a single operation that you have to go through once in your life and then never again.
This is so... Okay, so this is so interesting.
So to clarify that, when I said that my intuition is that I would prefer to have my memory suppressed, I was considering the rarer events, like going into an operation that you probably only have to do once, or something like the dentist. You might have to do that more than once, but it's still rare, right? But if you live with this kind of fear of insects around you, especially if you live in Australia, then I would definitely reconsider that. Right, because then the memory of knowing that it's not as bad as I thought it was going to be can be more helpful than not remembering the pain of one.
Now this is interesting because it brought up something else, another factor that goes right along with how often it happens. How avoidable is it? I've only ever been stung by a bee once, and I don't even remember it being that bad, despite the fact that I can't remember the exact sensation. I remember it not ruining my life, right? I know I didn't die. So it couldn't have been that bad. It just hurt a little bit. But the thing is, because it's so avoidable, I can avoid it, and it has this sort of inhibitive control over my life, versus the surgery is kind of unavoidable. It's avoidable, but I mean, like, if you, after going through the cost-benefit analysis, it's obvious that you should not avoid it.
So when you talk about avoidance in the case of the bees, are you referring to, locking yourself up in a place where the bees can't get to you? Or is it
literally just running away or walking away whenever I hear an insect? I can avoid it by just minding my own business and walking away from the area. Or sprinting, depending how close it is.
Yeah, bees can follow you, If a bee were seriously set on its decision to sting you, you couldn't outrun a bee. But I mean, you and I, we both know that bees don't actually have that kind of intent, right?
Wasps, on the other hand.
Well, even wasps, I don't know. I mean, why do they sting? Do they sting because they need to defend their hive or something? So if you run away from the hive, then I don't know, it might be fine.
As someone who's been in that situation, yes, usually it is fine. Though I still ran directly into my house and shut all of the doors and windows immediately. To relate this back then to the transporter paradox, we're imagining that this is, despite avoidable, extremely common, and it's to the point where sort of like it's the opposite of the surgery, where the surgery is rare and unavoidable, or it's, I guess, a middle ground between the surgery and the bee sting. The surgery is rare and practically unavoidable. The bee stings are common and extremely avoidable. The teleporter is common and kind of unavoidable if you want to, it's kind of like avoiding having a cell phone, Yeah.
It's
hard to do. that worries me. That's something I'm going to have to commonly go through this, and I definitely can't avoid it. It would worry me, or like I have the ability to technically avoid it, but I would never. That's why this bothers me so much. I would never be able to make the cost-benefit analysis that I want to because I can't remember what it felt like. So my brain's always going to have this missing variable in it for how it felt, and I'll always have to reevaluate that with how lucky do I feel.
Well, that's interesting because I think we've concluded here that there is a major difference in what you and I consider to be the important part of the experience, right? For me, it's the net effect. Like if I have to go through some, really horrible pain, obviously I will try to avoid it if I can, and I'll be nervous if I know beforehand that is gonna happen. But in the end, I might think to myself, okay, I've got it behind me. It's it's a good thing that it's over. And if I had to do it again, wait, this sounds bad because I'm not trying to say that if I had to do it again, I would go through the pain again. But what I'm saying is that if there is an obvious benefit to it, which the transporter, the benefit is obvious, then the net effect of being fine in the end might make it worth it. No, that was still a bad example.
Well, no, I think it's a good example that you didn't phrase correctly. Because
you're right.
The end result isn't not only that that you were fine, but it was also that you don't remember not being fine.
That's
so
right.
To you feel it's negligible because you'll never remember the pain.
That's why I should have used the operation now as an example, because even if I do remember the pain, there may still be a net benefit, such as, for example, not dying within a week. That makes it worth it, and I would go through it again if the same benefit presents itself.
No, the net benefit of the teleporter is obvious, and so even if you go through the pain and don't remember it, the benefit still highly outweighs what you imagine. I like, first of all, how this plays very much into who we are as people, because if you had told me before this started, one of you is going to be much more worried about the net benefits or detriments of an action, and one of you is going to be much more focused on the immediate effects, I would know exactly who was which.
Yeah.
So I like how this sort of how this exemplifies the two of us. Something that we moved on from but never really put the pin in is that I don't think this ever ended up having anything to do with the person. That I think we've completely agreed on the grounds that you are, for all intents and purposes, the same person going through the teleporter. And the idea is just, I guess it literally came down to, does it hurt? Which, yeah, again, no one thinks they're a different person when they come out of the dentist's office. So.
Agreed, yeah. But I don't know if we've already emphasized this, but with the dentist's office, you know that it's going to be painful, right? I mean, dentists are the archetype of a painful experience. Whereas with the transporter, the pain is entirely hypothetical. All of the people that you've ever talked to who've gone through the transporter tell you that it's just fine. There is like literally no pain at all. You literally just rematerialize in another place. So
that's something that we should have talked about. And
what?
I wish you had said that before. Do they say that there's no pain at all, or do they say I don't remember? Because those are two extremely different things.
Okay, but you're only making them different with the transporter. I mean, if you go on a plane, right, and someone asks you, was it painful? Then you would definitely say, no, it wasn't painful, as opposed to, I don't remember any pain. Because you have no reason to believe that, why would you lose any memory? By contrast, in the operation, especially if you know beforehand that you're going to get one of those sedatives that actually suppresses your memories, then you would definitely say, I don't remember any pain, but there was the sedative.
So I guess isn't the transporter an example of the latter, in which case you're not going to remember it?
Sort of, except that I see. Oh, we are really getting somewhere. You really got me thinking about this experience.
I'm glad I may have ruined the transporter for you in the future.
It's not that. I would still use the transport. Especially, as I said, if I've used it many times before. Even if every single time I experience some kind of, agonizing pain and then end up not remembering it, after a few times, I would just not fret about that anymore. Especially if it is still a hypothetical.
So something I wanted to point out, because I seem to do this a lot in our conversations. I did it in previous ones that weren't broadcast, but it's now important for me to pull the veil back, despite the fact that I have been the main one arguing for why this would be nerve-wracking for me. I'd probably be one of the first people to try it.
Right, but you already hinted at the fact that you don't want to be behind the times, and the transporter is obviously going to be just like the smartphone, something that you have to have, or be absolutely, shunned as a Philistine or a Luddite or an Amish, whatever.
Or an elderly person. Much like how smartphones have done.
Well, I didn't want to be discriminatory.
Sorry, apologies.
No, it's fine. Have you ever noticed that the kinds of people that deride our generation for not having good calligraphy or handwriting are the same people who can't turn off a computer without getting a virus? Right?
Yes.
So
I understand though. Like, I feel like there's we're branching so far out. I love it. Despite the fact that I would be immediately scared to do it, and I would be immediately scared each time, the long form fear would not exist. If something's unavoidable, at the beginning of the day, as it's happening, I'm terrified. But after it's over, I'm not as scared anymore because I can't avoid it. Same like with the teleporter, it's a little bit different because technically you can just choose to abstain. But let's say it was just unveiled, and this is funny. It's exactly like us talking about doing the podcast, where I was totally cool with it 100%. The idea was great. And then 5 minutes before, I'm sitting here nervously shaking.
Same.
But that's the sort of fear that would be the same thing with the transporter, is I have no problem with it and understanding. I have the understanding to know that it wouldn't matter. The pain wouldn't matter. But it's there's a difference between fundamentally understanding that you shouldn't be afraid and when the time comes not being afraid.
But even at this point, I mean the pain is still only hypothetical. Would it change anything if the researchers, realistically, it wouldn't even be the scientists. The scientists come up with some principles, and then the engineers create a machine, and then some researchers and developers test these machines and draw some conclusions, and then eventually a company will build it and market it, right? And by that time that it gets marketed, by the time that you are able to step into a transporter without explicitly being some kind of experimental, test subject, by that time, a lot of other things, non-humans, will have gone through the transporter, and a lot of data will have been gathered, a lot of research will have been made. So, would it make any difference to you if these findings, point very strongly at the idea that there is literally no conscious experience of the process and therefore also no pain?
I think what might do it for me, it would, and I am a very superficial person. I don't think any of the science talk would get to me, but I think seeing it happen, if I saw it happen and it wasn't like a cat goes through the teleporter and the cat gets obliterated, I would be terrified. But if it looked like it did in Star Trek or something, I probably wouldn't be worried.
Okay, well then how do you define obliterate? Because in Star Trek, the thing in the transporter does sort of disappear in a sort of white shining kind of, special effect.
Yeah, exactly. But that I guess the difference is being have you seen the original Willy Wonka film?
No, unfortunately.
I believe it also. So this child gets brought into his television, and the way it happens is he sits on a stage, and then you watch his molecules one by one fly off of his body and start flying through the air above him in this sort of beam of atoms of this child.
Right.
That's terrifying to watch that happen. To watch his molecules being stripped from his body.
Is it terrifying even if you don't see the child, reacting in any way sort of pained?
Yes. No, because he wasn't reacting in pain, but it's still terrifying.
Right, you see, I would probably take the fact that the child isn't screaming in pain as an indication that there probably isn't any pain. Which is not to say that I might not also be terrified to go through the procedure myself, but it would at least help
ease it a little bit.
Yeah, ease it a lot, honestly. Right, and it doesn't even have to be a child. It's fine if it's just a cat. So coming back to the hypothetical unveiling of the transporter, there would already be well-known footage of animals and other things being transported.
Yes. I think that definitely has the potential to make it not as terrifying. There's also something that I wanted to talk about, which is related, but a little bit of a tangent. How much would it ease your pain ease your fear if after the transporter came out, a new quote unquote painless transporter came out, despite the fact that there wasn't any proof of anything it said?
Well, that depends. I mean, if the new painless one is it depends. Okay, if the new painless one is the result of some kind of revelation that the old one was in fact painful and, we just didn't know, that would be different from if, the new transporter is just some kind of, let's address this hypothetical. Maybe, there is some pain involved and we're just gonna, we found a way to even mitigate that hypothetical, that possibility. Which reminds me, by the way, of all of this discussion about capital punishment in the United States, where they use these lethal injections, and they have to make sure that these injections are not at all painful, because otherwise it would constitute cruel and unusual punishment, which is unconstitutional in the United States. But there was this finding at one point which claimed that actually there is a possibility that some of the people executed with these lethal injections might actually experience pain in the last moments of their life, but unable to express it because they're already paralyzed. Right?
Yeah.
And that caused enough ethics concerns to halt all executions for at least some time.
Really?
I mean, if the transporter had something like this, there is no proof that any such pain actually happened. There's just some research that points at some possibility, and, no one wants to take any chances. If that is the reason for the new painless transporter, then I would probably just shrug it off. I would probably just say, I've already used the old transporter, I'm fine with it, and there's gonna be no different. It's just a sort of, it's an academic issue.
But that's the thing think about that. Think about it. So I feel like, so you just said all of that and made a completely the opposite conclusion that I would have made. Like, what? If there was even a chance that if I wasn't completely convinced that the first one didn't cause pain, and a new one made after the revelation that the first one might cause pain claims that it no longer does, I would definitely, even if the new one costed more let's say, I would definitely prefer the new one.
No, of course, I would also prefer the new one, sure. Oh, I see. Okay, the misunderstanding here is that, no, I didn't mean to say I would still use the old one. What I meant to say is that I would have no problem with the memory of having used the old one.
Oh, okay. No, I was more like, would you basically,
right. Would you still
use the old one? Consider it, yeah. If let's say the old one was cheaper, or it was more convenient to use the old one.
Right, I might still, because again, the pain is only hypothetical, and my own experience suggests that there is no net pain. Whatever pain I might experience, I will forget. And besides, even if there is, some pain, it still doesn't mean that it's anywhere near unbearable. You always make it sound like it's completely fine or it's like completely agonizing pain. But
that's fair.
But I mean, consider for example, having to go for a flu shot. There is definitely some pain involved, but it's only a tiny little eek, and it's not a big deal.
Yeah.
So in the scenario that you described, it is far more likely that the old transporter wasn't a big deal, even if there was some pain.
Hmm. You were talking about that I either assume that it's going to be agonizing or no pain at all. What would you assume it would be like? Because I assume agonizing. I assume the molecules being ripped from your body cannot feel good at all unless they like did knock you out first.
Well, of course it doesn't feel good. My default assumption is that it doesn't feel at all. Because once the molecules are away from each other, they literally can't interact anymore.
But it can't happen all at once.
Right, okay. So that
you can't detonate from the inside. You need to have, your skull needs to dissolve before your brain can.
I know what you're getting at, but again, that takes us back to the question of how fast does it have to be for you to consider it instantaneous? Even if the pain was on the level of being agonizing in terms of its intensity, but instantaneous in terms of its duration, then it might still be fine.
Interesting. So this is related, but how long do you think you could be on fire, burning? Like, if you could just stop it immediately and not have, just the pain of it, how long do you think is too long to be on fire? To experience the pain of immolating?
Well, unfortunately, that's not a good question because, once you have a burn, then it will continue to be painful even when you're no longer on fire.
I'm saying just the pain. The experience. How long is too long to experience the pain of immolating?
Okay, I am unfamiliar with the pain of immolating, and I don't know if you are.
I'm not, so it's perfect to be a hypothetical for our transporter, because neither of us know how much it hurts.
Yeah, but in your question about, you specifically chose immolating as an example because you assume that it's going to be agonizingly painful, and we have every reason to believe that it would be because people tend to scream when they're on fire, right?
That is true.
But what I was getting at is that, I have had some experience with heat. Some of us have, accidentally touched that hot plate on your stove or the pot or whatever, and, have a bit of a burn for, some amount of time, which then sort of subsides, right? But it's never instantly gone, right? It starts being painful and then it slowly subsides. This momentary pain, even if it's very intense, is not comparable to being immolated, because being immolated leaves you with the experience of having burns all over your body, which in itself is also painful.
So, again, I feel like you're taking my hypothetical question and trying to make it practical, and that is not what I'm looking for.
Okay, then let's try and salvage your question, and let's see if we can think of some kind of pain that is actually that actually stops fairly instantaneously. Can you think of one?
No.
Me neither.
Most things are painful because they have... See, this is the thing. Most things are painful because they're doing damage to your human body. Now, the transporter is doing damage to your human body, but it's resurrecting you as well. So it would be comparable to pain such like immolation. It's just that your new body would no longer experience the pain.
Yeah.
And you would stop experiencing the pain in an instant because you'd be brain dead at some point.
So to recap, your question to me then is, how long can I be immolated for me to say I'm not going to go through that?
Yes. Really, so there are two questions again, the same way that I had said earlier. There is how long is instantaneous if the pain is immolation level of pain. I feel like there's a difference between maybe instantaneous was 5 seconds if there's no pain, but it might be less if it's immolation. Or and then how long would it be? How short would it, or how long is the longest possible time that could be that you would still be willing to use it regularly?
Yeah, I think the answer to this is an integral. I think no, seriously, I think if you integrate over the period of time the amount of pain, then you get a sort of total pain.
Okay. Yes.
So I think the answer is going to be that this integral has to. There is going to be a threshold at which someone is going to say, no, I don't want to go through that.
Yes, I agree. But if not knowing all of the facts, this isn't testing your real experience. This is testing your fear of it.
Right. Yeah. Well, as I said before, I would try the transporter, and if I find that I have no memories of any pain, then I will just assume that there wasn't any pain and I will continue to use the transporter. Once I have memories of it being fine, I would probably be much less nervous, and over time be less and less and less nervous. In fact, I could even imagine resenting people for trying to make me feel nervous by pointing out all the ways in which you're being taken apart molecule by molecule.
Of course. No one should attempt to. I know that's what I'm doing right now, but the transporter doesn't exist yet, so I have free reign. Once the transporter existed, it's like someone with a fear of flying trying to say, hey, you might crash. It's like...
Exactly.
No, that's not something you do. Your fear of flying is a problem for you. You shouldn't make it a problem for anyone else. Yeah, you don't care if you don't remember it because you assume that it, it was negligible if you don't remember it. Whereas I assume that it was awful if I don't remember it.
Yeah. I think at this point, I mean, we've definitely not exhausted the topic. There's still a lot to talk about. But maybe at this point we could wrap up. Thank you all for listening to us. I think we've discussed this topic to quite a deep extent here. And until then, when are we going to have the next episode? I believe that 2 weeks from now was our schedule.
Yes, that would be the 7th of July.
And of course, if you'd like to support what we do, then please do visit our Patreon at patreon.com/keeptalking. Thank you all, and we'll see you.
Goodbye.